Can Rishi Sunak fix the Brexit deal in Northern Ireland? Why is childcare so expensive? And should Jeremy Corbyn be welcome in Keir Starmer's Labour Party? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Matt Warman, Jenny Chapman from Labour's Shadow Cabinet, The Guardian's Raphael Bear and Madeline Grant from The Daily Telegraph. On the programme.
We are by no means done. There is no deal that is done. There's work to do, and that's what we will set about doing.
Have Rishi Sunak's backbenchers blocked him from striking a new Brexit deal with the EU?
I don't think he's ever been as keen a Brexiteer as I was. I mean, I spoke all over the country to try and persuade people to vote in the referendum, and I'm not sure the Prime Minister did.
Women aren't worth it. They don't care if we're in the workforce or not. They say they're progressing, but really they just want us at home, cooking and cleaning.
We'll speak to this mother who says the cost of childcare priced her out of a job.
Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate.
There's no appeal, there's no system. I've just been told I'm suspended. I think that's a pretty poor way of treating people, quite honestly.
Keir Starmer says he doesn't want his old boss, Jeremy Corbyn, to be a Labour MP. Let's start with this story in the Sunday Times. The headline, refugee cap plans floated by ministers. This is the story in the paper that the government is considering plans to give powers to Parliament to set an annual cap on the number of refugees as opposed to looking at general net migration. The minister, Robert Jenrick, says there should be an honest debate. Each year, many local authorities are at breaking point in terms of providing resources. So my opening question to the panel is, should there be a cap on the number of refugees set by Parliament for the UK every year? Matt?
Well, I think the short answer ultimately is yes for me, and that's largely because I think we need a system for immigration that takes into account all the different channels, and we need an honest conversation about it. Now, that means both sensible, safe routes for people to apply, as we've had for Ukraine, Afghanistan, for instance, but also perhaps beyond. But it also means a sensible conversation about the overall numbers, and that might also allow us to process applications a lot faster as well. Right,
well, the overall numbers, record numbers on net migration, 504,000 for the most recent year. 73,000 on top of that, asylum applications, including those arriving in small boats over the English Channel. I think that was the figure to September last year. Should there be a cap on the number of refugees?
Well, I'm all for the honest conversation bit, but I think this cap stuff, people just see straight through it. You know, what they really need to do is figure out why it is that fewer than half the number of asylum decisions are being made now than were 5 years ago. So you can put whatever cap on it you want. If you're not actually getting through the caseload that you already have, you're still going to end up with more and more people living in unregulated accommodation, including children, and actually failing to deal with the underlying problem that you've got. And I just... You know, I think people can see through all this stuff from the government now. They like to throw out this, we're going to do a cap on this, we're going to be tough on the other. And actually, nothing changes, nothing gets done. We need a complete change of approach to this. Labour's put forward a plan on how we would deal with things like the small boat crossings. And it involves having grown-up conversations with our nearest neighbours, getting to grips with the root causes of all this, having the National Crime Agency with a focus on dealing with the gangs and the people who are trafficking and making money out of this misery. And we think that's a much more sensible approach.
And so you'd have no targets and no caps at all on either end of this?
We all want the number of people needing to claim asylum to go down. Of course we do. So, and that should be the aim. This is not about having an open door, but please deal with the causes and the real issues here, and stop treating the public like idiots and saying we're going to put a cap on it, because they don't achieve these things. Having a cap doesn't change anything.
I'll come to Rafa in just a moment. I mean, the tens of thousands, of course, on net migration, famously, has never been hit, has it?
No, it hasn't. But I think that Jenny went through a very long-winded way of not answering the question. You have to be able to say what is the number. No, you have to be able to say what is the number that you want that system that you're talking about functioning well. What should it be coping with? What's a sensible target? That has to be part of this, because until it is, we're going to keep having these conversations where it never reaches a sort of sensible conclusion.
I mean, is it difficult to find the right number? Although Robert Jenrick, the Minister, is suggesting that it's looked at every year to look at what could be a cap, or does the public see through it, as Jenny said?
Well, yeah, I think ultimately it's a political assertion of will to do something about a problem that the public cares about, and by saying we'll have caps or we'll have targets, we'll have numbers, that's a sort of a rhetorical device when, already we've seen actually the numbers are very difficult to control and the system is dysfunctional. I think specifically you've got a problem with refugees, because if you accept that people are genuine refugees, and you have to at least work on the assumption that, if you're using the category refugee, these are people who want asylum, they have a legitimate claim to asylum. I mean, some politicians will say that doesn't exist or that these are somehow bogus claims, but, we're talking here about refugees. You can't control the supply of refugees because that's a function of how many crises there are, how many wars there are, how many emergencies there are. So you set your cap, you're basically saying, well, we have this amount of demand for refugees. A society can only tolerate, we're only comfortable with a certain number of refugees. And anyone else, your need just stops at our borders and you can go off somewhere else. Now, if you want to have an honest conversation, by all means, say, yeah, ultimately there's a limit to compassion, and after a while, refugees, we don't care about them anymore, and they can go and suffer somewhere else. That would be what the honest statement about having a cap would be. Otherwise, you're having to respond to where the emergencies are and what the need is.
I mean, part of the numbers on net migration, Madeleine, the reason they're so high is because of people coming from Ukraine, people coming from Hong Kong. They are actually not counted in the asylum applications in that sense. Would a cap be useful?
That's a really good point. Firstly, that last year was an unnaturally high number, and I think it's perhaps wrong to take that as demonstrative of a normal year, a normal amount of migrant and refugee flows into the country. I mean, I think that we do necessarily have some kind of cap, whether we talk about it or not, because as Raphael mentioned in his scenario, there is a limit to what people can tolerate and also what we as a country can afford. I mean, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but when you start looking at GDP, it goes down a lot, and I think there is a finite public demand for this. I think maybe having a cap is a good way of sort of focusing minds and saying we intend to do something about this. But I just think that given the way that the government has already shown that it's very, very difficult to get a grip on these numbers, as Jenny mentioned, it's not making particular progress or speed with processing them. It all feels a bit of a kind of by-the-by conversation, because in the meantime, how would you actually begin to impose or to see that cap through with real policy? It just sounds like words to me.
We're going to leave it there and talk about the Northern Ireland Protocol. That is the trading arrangement negotiated during the Brexit talks. It meant that Northern Ireland would follow the EU broadly, or be in the single market for goods, separate to the rest of the UK, in order to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is in the EU. But it has led to an effective customs border down the Irish Sea. Rishi Sunak, we were expecting actually an announcement possibly today or tomorrow about a new deal that's been reached. But let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Rishi Sunak forced to pause protocol deal amid backlash from senior Conservatives and the Democratic Unionist Party. Now, one of those senior Conservatives could be Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Cabinet Minister. He's from the European Research Group of MPs, and he said this last night on the BBC.
The view of the DUP will be very influential with the ERG, and that's why their tests are so important. And the Prime Minister needs to be negotiating from what will be acceptable to the DUP and to the voters in Northern Ireland as a starting point, rather than trying to present them with a fait accompli and say take it or leave it.
That was Jacob Rees-Mogg. Let's talk to the BBC's Ireland correspondent, Emma Vardy. Emma, hello to you. Bring us up to date with where we are with the negotiations with Rishi Sunak and the EU.
Well, it had been looking like there might be a deal today or tomorrow, and then over the weekend those hopes gradually faded away, and all the noises coming out of Brussels that we're hearing at the moment, it now looks more likely to be midweek or towards the end of the week. But there was that flurry of activity on Friday when the Prime Minister came over to speak to all the parties, but we all knew that the conversations across the table with the DUP were going to be the crucial ones. On Friday, the DUP were positive, but also cautious. And I think what we take from that is, look, a number of the DUP's tests for whether the protocol deal is acceptable to them, it sounds like some of those tests have been met, but it's not all the way there yet. So the DUP were impressing on the Prime Minister the things they really need to be able to sell this deal to the unionist electorate. And Rishi Sunak's got a big call to make.
Right, and on that, I mean, the big political problem, Emma, is that Northern Ireland effectively doesn't have a government because the Democratic Unionist Party pulled out of power sharing at Stormont some time ago over this issue of the protocol. What, in your view, is needed to bring the DUP back on board?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for people in Northern Ireland is run by civil servants. There's no ministers in post. That causes problems in all sorts of areas, not least Brexit or trading arrangements. What's needed in the DUP's view, their big picture argument to all of this is they need to preserve the integrity of the UK. For them, that means not having all these onerous checks on goods which are coming across the Irish Sea and staying in Northern Ireland. They don't want Northern Ireland to be treated differently to the rest of the UK. So if there are laws, EU rules, which companies in Northern Ireland have to abide by, which the rest of the UK doesn't, they feel that Northern Ireland will increasingly become more separate from the rest of the UK over time. And that is really the big picture for them. They have, as I said, these 7 tests that they will judge any deal against. But really it is about, can they take this to the unionist electorate and can they argue that really in their view the protocol has all but been ditched and the new offer on the table is something completely different which restores Northern Ireland's place within the UK. That is the big picture for them. But it's difficult because, of course, no sides get everything they want in a negotiation. There will be hardliners in the DUP who say, no, we need to stay out of Stormont. We need to keep a hard line on this. Others will say we need to get back into Stormont. We're going to have to compromise somewhere. It's not just a big call for Rishi Sunak. It's a really big call for the leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, as well.
Emma Vardy, thank you very much. Well, is this helping Rishi Sunak strike a deal? This headline in the Daily Mirror, Boris Johnson plotting to oust Rishi Sunak so he can return as Prime Minister, warns former Chancellor George Osborne. He said that yesterday. On the other hand, we have this in The Independent, suicidal treachery, Tory grandee's stark warning to Boris Johnson allies over Brexit result. This is the ex-Foreign Office Minister, Sir Alan Duncan. It doesn't sound like it's going very well within the Conservative Party, does it, Matt, in terms of getting MPs on board to support any deal Rishi Sunak strikes?
Well, I think it's no surprise that this is something that arouses immense passions from both sides of the Conservative Party on Brexit. But the reality is, until we see what the deal entails, everyone here is somewhat in the dark. So I think what you're seeing clearly from people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and the ERG is attempts to try and nudge the Prime Minister in a certain direction, and you're getting some of that from the other side as well.
Should Rishi Sunak ignore them? Should Rishi Sunak just ignore these noises off from a particular wing of the Conservative Party or not?
No, I don't think he should ignore anybody, but I do think what he should be doing is focusing on a deal that gets both the protocol right, or the future Brexit relationship with Northern Ireland right, gets the Assembly back up and running, and also focus on the needs of the people of Northern Ireland. I think that is what will convince people on all sides of the argument that he's doing the right thing.
Is it helpful, Boris Johnson's intervention?
Well, his reminder of the bill that he had as a sort of backstop, I think, is a sensible observation. It's a statement of the obvious as well. But I think we also need to bear in mind that both sides need to move a little bit on this, because the nature of compromise is what will give us a deal.
But he's obviously angering some people, Boris Johnson, within the Conservative Party.
I think there's always different sides of the Conservative Party angering other bits of the argument. Let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the need to get a deal done and the need to, crucially, make sure that that Assembly is back up and running, because that's what's really hurting the people in Northern Ireland.
Right, but who's going to give way here, within the Conservative Party particularly? I mean, or are we going to return to the sort of Brexit wars that we've seen over the last few years?
Well, to be honest, I think the question is really about what the DUP make of it, more so than indeed than the Conservative Party. Right. Although obviously that is a concern. I mean, there's a very real chance that, you know, even if there are some further concessions made, that for the DUP this is really a matter of sovereignty, not so much about, you know, merely the simple movement of goods. I'm not sure that a red and green lane will necessarily solve those fundamental issues of sovereignty.
And this is to sort of fast-track certain goods heading for Northern Ireland.
If the DUP say no, then it will have been a failure, because then you won't get the functioning Stormont. And I doubt it would even be, they'd consider even putting it to the Commons under those circumstances.
Right. Well, of course, Keir Starmer's called for a vote to come to the Commons, so MPs, I should say, can decide whether they like the deal or not. But we already know Sir Keir Starmer likes it, because he's pretty well said, we'll back you, Rishi Sunak, even if Conservative MPs don't.
Keir isn't calling for a vote to happen, but he says if a vote should be needed, that the Labour Party would back a deal. And I'll tell you why that is. You do not play games with the politics of Northern Ireland. This is serious stuff. This is whole communities who are being destabilised because there's some fringe problem in the Tory party that Rishi Sunak cannot control. He knows there's a deal. By all accounts, he's done a deal. And all that he needs to do now is to actually put it forward, put it to Parliament and get that vote through. And what the trouble is here, he is so weak that he is allowing himself to be pushed around by the ERG, by Boris Johnson, by noises, people that no one in Darlington's ever heard of, and he is not able to deliver his party. Now, Starmer's offer to say, look, if you need our votes to get this through, like we have done on occasions in the past, we will vote to get this through because we think this is the right thing to do. You cannot move forward in our relationship with the EU, in issues like Horizon, and moving forward as a country until you've dealt with this issue. It's taking up a huge amount of government bandwidth and it needs to be resolved.
No doubt much of that is true, but fundamentally, if you don't have the consent of the biggest unionist party, you do not have the power-sharing agreement, and you do not have a functioning Stormont.
So what you need to do, you are the Prime Minister of a country that the DUP want to, they support the Conservative Party. You need to use your diplomatic skills, your political skills. You need to involve all communities in Northern Ireland, which they should have been doing months ago. We've been calling for this for a very long time now. They've totally failed to do that. And now they're left in a situation of turning up at the very last minute, saying, here's your deal, take it or leave it. It's completely the wrong way to have handled this.
First of all, spoiler alert, right, the DUP answer will be no.
Exactly,
His answer is always no. And, although I don't necessarily agree with the DUP position on this, I understand why they feel betrayed by the Conservative Party on this, because essentially Boris Johnson completely betrayed them. He did a deal, and every single Conservative MP who voted for the deal that was done in 2019 said it was an excellent deal, and the ERG said very clearly this satisfies all of our requirements on sovereignty. They then turned around, they sold it to the British public in a general election on exactly that basis. They said, Boris Johnson said very clearly there would be no border down the Irish Sea, no customs border, which was turned out to be completely untrue. Every Conservative MP who voted for that deal either didn't really understand what it said, in which case they were derelict in their responsibility as parliamentarians, or they did understand, but they didn't actually want to support it. They knew immediately they were going to renege on it, which was fundamentally dishonest. That clip that you saw of Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier, he said something very interesting. He said, we need to get the DUP on side with this and the voters of Northern Ireland. The voters of Northern Ireland, a majority, support the existing protocol. So the voters of Northern Ireland and the DUP are two quite different things. And what's actually happening there is Jacob Rees-Mogg is doing what he always does, what English Tories always do. They are using the politics of Northern Ireland to make points about Eurosceptic theology regarding sovereignty, to have reenact whatever civil wars they want to reenact, because 2019 was their finest hour and Brexit has just gone downhill since then. That's the game they're playing. That's the game they've always played. And in answer to your first question, should Rishi Sunak ignore them? Yes, of course he should ignore them. He should just tell them where to go and do the deal to move on to a future of better relations with the European Union.
Matt?
Well, I agree that we need to do a deal. I agree that we need to move on. I think that's a pretty cynical interpretation of where we
but is it true?
From 2019. So I think this has always been about how the deal that was done was in practice implemented. And we've seen the EU shift hugely on things that it said it would never be able to countenance changing. So I think what was envisaged when that deal was done is not what has come to pass. The fact that we're now trying to make it work shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody.
Right. I mean, there is an issue, Raphael, with the Democratic Unionist Party when you say the majority of voters and even the majority of members of Stormont, when it was sitting, supported the protocol. But the problem is the Good Friday Agreement is not based on majoritarianism, you could call it. It is based on cross-community consent. So how do you get around that?
Well, I agree, and it's very difficult. The tragedy is that the political capital that Boris Johnson had after 2019, that could have been spent, and the political capital that Rishi Sunak has that could have been spent basically talking to the DUP and saying, this is the best deal you're going to get, this is the arrangement we have, this is how we move forward, was instead spent saying, oh, actually, no, you're right, this deal's absolutely terrible, it's rubbish, and we're going to pick a fight with the EU, and we're going to pass this other piece of legislation that essentially rips up a treaty that we've done, demonstrates us to be essentially untrustworthy in international relations, to sort of stoke the anger and stoke the fire of the DUP, with a view that would somehow put pressure on the EU, which it's utterly failed to do. So, I mean, I agree, it's incredibly difficult, but tragically, the opportunity to try and bring the DUP on board was squandered by Boris Johnson from the moment he signed the deal.
Right. Have Conservative governments consistently mishandled this issue?
No, I don't think so. But what I do think
you're
is
not
definitely
sure.
true. No. What I definitely think is true is that we've ended up with a deal that is misunderstood by both sides and needs to be rethought. That's what we're now in the process of doing. I think the fact that the EU have moved so far demonstrates that they acknowledge that some of it could have been handled a lot better. Are there bits that we could have done better with hindsight? Of course there are, but hindsight is pretty useless in advance.
I mean, the problem with Matt's sort of looking back and sort of rewriting a bit of history is this was an agreement. There's no envisioning needed about how this would work. It's all there in black and white, and the Tories agreed to it. They shouldn't have presented the deal as it was, because the checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland are a problem. They were always going to be a problem.
But could it work with these lanes, with a green lane and a red lane? You could allow goods to go to Northern Ireland without checks or fewer checks, and others headed for Ireland, the single market.
It is very important to reduce the checks. That trade friction does need to be sorted. The Labour Party's never said the protocol was a good thing and should be left alone. Of course that needs to be done. But what's happened now is it's become much, much bigger because of the failure to manage the politics around this and to engage with parties and with businesses and organisations and civic society in Northern Ireland. That's how this should have been handled. The opportunity has been completely thrown away by the Tory party because they are riven with infighting and division. And that is what's so sad about this. And to use Northern Ireland as the vehicle for your desire to bring down Rishi Sunak if you're a Johnson supporter, or to have a go at Boris Johnson if you're a Sunak supporter, our politics has got to be far, far better than this.
Look, I think no one should take lessons from the Labour Party on being riven with division within your own party. But ultimately, there are fundamental disagreements about the nature of Brexit across the political spectrum and within the EU as well. I think what we're now seeing is the sort of home straight to a resolution to that. That is something that we should welcome, and that is something that I would hope the DUP, the ERG, a whole host of others will look at clear-eyed and say, come on, this is actually beneficial to all of us.
But they're not. That's not what's happening.
Well, time will tell. You haven't seen the deal, I haven't seen the deal, they haven't seen the deal. Let's be realistic about this. It's politically advantageous for Labour to damn it at this stage. No. The reality is we've got to wait and see.
Look at what they're saying, Matt.
What they're saying is that they haven't seen the deal, and neither have you. So what is it that you want to see in practice? Surely you would want to see them look at it and be pragmatic.
I want to see a negotiated outcome here that gets through Parliament and that is implemented, and we get stability. And what your guys, Tory MPs, are saying today, this morning, publicly, is they're setting out their tests that they know are not going to be met by this deal. They know that's because they don't want to support it.
As you know.
They do not want to support this because they're using it to further their Tory infight. That's what's going on. And you need to recognise that, because you're not... Sunak needs to stand up to it. He needs to face it down and move on.
I don't disagree that we definitely need to see strength from the Prime Minister.
Well, I'm not
absolutely agree with that. But I think what has to also be the case is that all sides need to take a look at this with a pragmatic eye.
Let's move on and have a look at this headline in the Eye. Universal credit childcare payments could be increased in the budget, which is coming up in a few weeks' time, to get parents back to work. Now, this refers to possible reforms in next month's budget, as we all guess what Jeremy Hunt is going to say, the Chancellor, particularly in this case to childcare support to help parents get back to work. Well, let's hear from some parents concerned about the costs of childcare. BBC Politics South's Marcella Whittingdale has this report.
Look. Yay. I'm a fully qualified level 7 postgraduate HR manager, and I'm not doing anything with it because financially it doesn't make sense.
Alexandra Meski from Tunbridge Wells says her childcare costs were so high she ended up effectively paying to go to work.
3 days a week was about £900 a month. and that is just shy of our mortgage. We've got basically 2 mortgages. If we have another child right now, we would not be able to afford it.
Mum to 17-month-old Emmeline, Alexandra tried for months to make working work, but says she was effectively priced out of the job market. It's left her feeling redundant.
Yeah, just like we're not worth it. Women aren't worth it. They don't care if we're in the workforce or not. They're not encouraging us. It's like they don't want us at the table. They just want us at home. They say they're progressing, but really they just want us at home, cooking and cleaning, and looking after, the children, because then it saves them having to invest.
In Burgess Hill, Vicky Burton's also keen to get back to her much-loved job as a visual stylist for an interiors company. But she and her husband are debating whether that's worth it, practically or financially. The government does provide 30 hours of free childcare across 38 weeks of the year to parents in England, but it doesn't start till the term after a child turns 3.
I currently have 2 children, one who's 10 months, one who's 2, and neither of them will qualify until they turn 3. You know, the best part of like 50 quid, which is our take-home money. So yeah, we're at that kind of stage at the moment going, I'll be going to work, which is great for me, but I'll be going to work for the privilege of working.
The Lime Tree Workshop in Sevenoaks is a co-working space used by many mothers. It's where Ali Tate comes to run the support group MIB Network for Mums in Business. She says many of her members have left successful careers to build businesses which work around their childcare commitments.
We are losing so much talent out of the workplace. It's so key. There's all these people who've been through an education system, often been to university or further education. They've had really good jobs, they've been really successful, and we are literally letting that talent go out of this country because we're not looking after those people.
Last October, Alexandra was one of thousands of women who joined the March of the Mummies, a rally organised by charity Pregnant Then Screwed. They're calling for more investment so everyone has access to affordable childcare, flexible working and properly paid parental leave. The government says it's invested more than £10.5 billion into early education over the past 3 years, and that they're looking into options to improve the cost flexibility and availability of childcare. But Vicky and Alexandra say unless improvements are built into the system, many mums and their children will be left at the bottom of the pile.
That was very clear there at the end. BBC Politics South East, Marcella Whittingdale reporting. You heard from Alexandra Meskey there in the report. She joins us now from our Tunbridge Wells studio. Welcome to you, Alexandra. Tell us a little bit more about your personal experience.
So I went back to work when my daughter was 6 months old. I really missed working. I wanted to get back into the workforce.
Yes.
So I took up a position as a standalone HR manager in a social care setting, and it was 3 days a week, hybrid working, so a mixture of at home and in the office. And that was 3 days a week, and for the 3 days it cost, I looked at the figures, it was £950 a month to put my daughter in childcare. But the nursery was regularly shut in due to staff shortages, so I'd lose money there. I'd have to take unpaid leave from work. After 9 months, the mental load, the stress of trying to be a HR manager in social care is quite stressful, and it just wasn't worth me coming home having a couple of £100 in my bank account to show for it.
Do you think politicians have and are taking this issue of childcare and affordability seriously enough?
I think the hand is being forced to take it seriously because there's enough noise being made by charities like Pregnant and Screwed, and the march we all went on. But what they announce in the spring budget will really truly show if they are taking it seriously. They need to stop viewing childcare as glorified babysitting services and see it as essential educational infrastructure for our early years setting.
Alexandra, stay with us and listen to what our guests have to say. What do you make of what you've just heard from Alexandra? Are you expecting and would you like to see something serious on childcare, an offer from Jeremy Hunt?
Yes, is the short answer. If the Chancellor has a single penny for a rabbit to come out of the hat, then for me it should be going on childcare in this budget. I think that's partly... I've got a 10-week-old baby at home. I'm somewhat party-pre on this, but I do think this is such a huge issue. That crunch point for people going back after maternity leave and then before any any of the free childcare hours kick in. Really painful. I think that needs to be addressed. But there's a whole host of other things, for instance, around money that is there not being claimed.
Right.
So I think there's a really good case for spending and for reform on this if there is any money available.
Right. So do you think the government has got a plan to get someone like Alexandra back to work?
Well, I wish I knew what was in the budget, but I do think absolutely the government certainly gets just how important this issue is, and I hope that the forthcoming budget is where they can make a move on it, but I think it will be an issue with us for some time to come as well.
Labour's been talking about this for quite a while. The Times headline here, Bridget Phillips and Labour's childcare plan will be like the birth of the NHS. What exactly does that mean?
It means we need something which is a big change, but it's got to be simple. So one of the other problems that you haven't touched on yet about with the way things are organised now, it is so damn complicated to work out what you're entitled to. If your hours change, what does that mean? Can you find somewhere that can provide what you need close enough to home in a way that's accessible to you? Yeah. It's so complicated. There's credits for this, there's vouchers for that. So we've got to simplify the whole thing. OK. So
But that would... I mean, if it's going to be like the birth of the NHS, I mean, there are no figures attached. I mean, what are we talking about? Billions of pounds here,
There will be. So we will have... Yes, there will. We will have a fully costed plan in time for the next election. What we've said so far is that we want to do the before school bit. So one of the problems that parents have is being able to find childcare which is before 9 o'clock in the morning. So we're going to do breakfast clubs. We've said that already. Yes. Clearly, that is a tip of the iceberg, and we will be announcing much more detail as we go forward.
So you might put up taxes to raise the sorts of money
everything we do will be fully costed. We're not going to be putting up taxes. We've said that we're going to do the tax on private schools. We said we're going to do the non-doms. We said we're going to do the windfall tax on the oil and gas companies. So we know as the Labour Party that we have to be absolutely precise and clear about where every single penny comes from.
Right. I mean, is this going to be a defining issue at the next election, Madeleine?
I think so, yes. I mean, I think that it's been ignored for far too long. Yeah. But I've found I'm 30, I don't have a baby, sadly, but my friends who do, and a lot of them are getting to that stage now where they're thinking about it or about to, it genuinely has a radicalising effect on people. People who were totally apolitical before are now, like we saw in the video, people going out on marches and so forth. It has had this effect. And interestingly, in the Australian election last year, Anthony Albanese won that election partly on the basis of promising a very generous childcare policy. And I think that, awareness is growing across the board that this is a very difficult country in which to try to raise a child. Not just the childcare, but also things like in other countries, if you have kids, that is explicitly recognised in the tax system. So in France, you have to be, if you have kids, you don't enter the top bracket until you're earning a lot more than if you don't have kids, and this kind of thing. So
is this an issue then that is coming of age, childcare and funding it?
Well, you'd hope so. I mean, my children are now older than that, but I remember exactly these scenarios where people essentially had to make a choice to be worse off but stay in the labour market, and essentially having childcare was essentially a cost. I think the point about how complex it is very important. As I understand it, there's also the sort of perverse unintended consequences have gone into the system where because some people are entitled to the subsidised cost, that then sort of hikes up the cost for other users, so there's huge differentials. And also, I mean, to be honest, I think Alexandra made this point that if this had been an issue of men being locked out of the workforce or being priced out of the workforce, we would have been having this conversation 10, 15 years ago. I mean, I think she made a very good point in the film there that it is essentially, because it's about women in the labour market, it's taken that much longer for it to percolate up politically that we're now talking about it and it's going to be in the budget.
And were you nodding away, but you're glad you said it?
I'm just glad to hear that from a man. I mean, that does say we're at a slightly different point than we were when I had to give up work after I had my second child, because it just wasn't worth, we couldn't afford it. And I think so many people have had to leave the labour market for 2-3 more years because they couldn't afford to go to work. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And that affects them, that scarring on their career doesn't, you don't just slot back in. You've got retraining, you often can't go back in at the same level that you left. It's a huge problem for the country.
But, as Matt alluded to earlier, sometimes there has been a problem of people not taking things up. I think in the coalition government, there was a plan to give greater shared parental leave and therefore for men to take more. But it was hardly used at all by those who were eligible, which might be a problem of not advertising it well enough. But actually, you may also have a problem if men simply aren't taking it up or aren't inclined to do so.
Alexandra, what do you make of what you've heard?
I think it was fantastic that mentioning that if this was about men being priced out of the workforce, this would have been spoken about years ago. It's 2023. We need to be living in a society where women aren't forced to choose between children and a career.
Alexandra Mesky, thank you very much for joining us and taking part and contributing to that film. We're going to talk about Jeremy Corbyn, the former Labour leader who has been suspended from the party and sits in Parliament as an independent. You may remember in 2020 the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, when he was leader, has been responsible for unlawful acts of harassment and discrimination against Jewish people. He was suspended by Keir Starmer, and now Starmer has confirmed that he will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election. Let's have a listen.
Let me be very clear about that. Jeremy Corbyn will not stand for Labour at the next general election as a Labour Party candidate. What I said about the party changing, I meant, and we are not going back, and that is why Jeremy Corbyn will not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election.
There has been no process. There has been no discussion. There have been no appeal. There's no system. I've just been told I'm suspended. I think that's a pretty poor way of treating people, quite honestly. It shows a lack of process of any sort. And that is the situation we're in at the moment. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I attend meetings of my local Labour Party. I work with people in the local Labour Party, and I campaigned for them in the local elections.
Well, that was Jeremy Corbyn. We're joined by Jess Barnard, Labour Executive Committee member, and also a member of the political organisation Momentum that was set up in support of Jeremy Corbyn. Is Keir Starmer right to say that he won't be able to stand Jeremy Corbyn as a Labour candidate at the next general election?
Absolutely not. To put this into context, when Keir Starmer was elected leader of the Labour Party, he promised members he would back not only policies that they overwhelmingly support, but he promised to end NEC stitch-ups and to make sure that local members decide their candidates. And he promised to unite the party in doing so. And obviously last week, and in that clip you've just played, we've heard he's telling members if they don't like the changes that he's made to leave the party. He's personally blocking Jeremy Corbyn from standing, not even an NEC block. He is personally intervening. And that's a man who has been re-elected to Parliament 10 times, who's represented his community for decades, and he is a Labour Party member. Let's get that really clear. He has the same rights of any of us. He's not suspended as a member. And so what Keir is actually doing is overriding the rules and procedures of the party and removing the democratic right of members to have their say. And I think a lot of members feel really alarmed by this because it's not just incredibly undemocratic, but it's also really intolerant towards a huge part of the party who, have different opinions from Keir's.
Right. Would you like him to stand as an independent, Jeremy Corbyn?
I can't really comment on what I think Jeremy should do, but obviously I think
if you can't stand as a Labour candidate, would you rather that he then stood as an independent rather than not standing at all?
I'm not a constituent of Jeremy's, and so it's not really for me to say what I would like him to do. I think the important thing to say is, I'm a Labour Party member, and I joined the Labour Party because I believe in Labour's ability to deliver change in our country, and that's what I want to see doing.
All right.
What I feel that Keir is doing is backtracking on all the promises he made. He's taking away the voice of our members in Jeremy's constituency, in Islington North, who want to have a say. And that's going back on the promises he's made is not what he was elected to do. And if he'd been honest about his intentions in January 2020, he wouldn't have been successfully elected leader.
What do you say, Jenny, to Jess Barnard saying that it's undemocratic what Keir Starmer has done in terms of saying he can't stand as a Labour candidate?
Well, he can't. Of course he can't, because he refused to apologise for his reaction to the EHRC report.
And that was the Equalities and Human Rights Commission.
That is what this all comes back to. And Jeremy Corbyn, I'm afraid, is a figure in Labour's past now, but he is not going to be a part of Labour's future. We are a serious party who wants to form a government, and you cannot have Keir Starmer as leader being in any way relaxed about some of the things that Jeremy Corbyn himself has failed to say. He wouldn't even... there was some sort of Facebook post he'd done about the EHRC report. He wouldn't even see his way to removing it. There were things like that really, I just think you have to have, yes, there's internal party democracy, of course, that's very important, but you have to have a standard of integrity and credibility to be able to be a Labour MP. It's a hugely privileged position, and you're representing your community in the party on the national stage, and you cannot allow Jeremy Corbyn now to fulfil that role. And I think Keir Starmer's absolutely right to be clear about that.
Jess?
Well, I mean, you know, to quote Keir Starmer himself on this, when he stood to be leader of the Labour Party, he said, "I want to pay tribute to Jeremy Corbyn, who led our party through some really difficult times, who energised our movement, and who was a friend as well as a colleague." Those were his own words about Jeremy Corbyn. And I think the problem with this is that this is a move from Keir Starmer and his leadership to say that there is no space for disagreement in the Labour Party. You know, there's no space for people who want to champion the policies we stand for, like public ownership, wealth taxes, championing anti-racism. All of these things, there seems to be no space for discussion in. And we're seeing people, not just Jeremy actually, you know, we're seeing a lot of people blocked from standing to be Labour candidates because they have taken different positions to Keir Starmer.
Right.
And that's not an acceptable situation to find ourselves in as a party. If we want to bring forward the best, you know, best candidates, local talent, and make sure that we protect, you know, local democracy and keep people's faith in the Labour Party, then those, you know, we need to be challenging Keir on his practice here.
Raphael?
Yeah, I mean, there's some different things being conflated here, aren't there? Because, you know, you can be a backbench Labour MP and say all sorts of things that are very, very left-wing on economic terms. You could call for nationalising the internet. You could call for, you know, pretty much anything short of Bolshevik revolution to overthrow the government and anti-Semitism, right? These are the things. There are limits, right? So if you want to say stopping Jeremy Corbyn from running as an MP, as a Labour MP, is about sort of denying pluralism on the left, that's a very peculiar place for the Labour left to want to be, because what they're really saying is, in order to have pluralism on the left, you've got to tolerate a bit of anti-Semitism. You've got to allow that there's going to be some anti-Semitism in the mix because Jeremy's too important. I would strongly advise the left of the Labour Party to not take that position, because ultimately Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the party at a time when it became infested with anti-Jewish racism. He essentially, through the things he said, through the things he did, through the things he failed to repudiate, he was essentially a magnet for anti-Semitism. He was the permission for anti-Semitism. And as I say, if Momentum and the Labour left want to say, no, but he's too precious to our movement and we have to forgive him for all of that and we have to honour him despite his failure to even understand the basic issue, then they're committing themselves to total marginalisation and irrelevance in British politics.
Jess?
That's just an absolutely outrageous allegation. And as I said,
well, what's the allegation? What's the allegation?
That Jeremy Corbyn is a magnet for anti-Semitism and that we're permitting anti-Semitism in the party by allowing Jeremy to stand.
Remember that you were
That's completely untrue.
But just, hang on, Jess. Well, I will let you answer. But just to answer, the Equality and Human Rights Commission did find that Labour had been responsible for unlawful acts of harassment and discrimination against Jewish people.
And I'm not disputing that.
Right.
And I want to be really clear, one anti-Semite in the party is too many. It has no place in the Labour Party, and we need to be taking the issue incredibly seriously. But that also means listening to the Ford report, which was commissioned by Keir Starmer on this issue, and that included warnings of the instrumentalisation of anti-Semitism for factional ends. And that's something we also have to take into account. We need a hugely strong stance on anti-Semitism, and it also needs to be, you know, we need to have a strong stance on all forms of anti-racism. And that's absolutely not being disputed here, but I absolutely do dispute, you know, the comments that were just made. And let me be really clear: Jeremy Corbyn is not under investigation for anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. He has not been suspended as a member. If he was, then he would be suspended and kicked out of the Labour Party for that. But he hasn't been. All that's happened is he's had the whip removed, which is a political move by Keir Starmer.
All right, Jess Barnard, thank you very much for joining us. Jeremy Corbyn, as you will have noticed, is not here on the panel, but we interviewed him. I interviewed him a few weeks ago on Politics Live about strikes and his position within the Labour Party. And you can watch this alongside other past episodes of Politics Live on BBC iPlayer now. That's all we have time for from our guest today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.